I woke to the shrill beep of my alarm at precisely 5:47 a.m., a rhythm I had trained myself into over years of routine. The room was dim, the faint gray light of early winter just starting to seep through the blinds. My hand fumbled for the snooze button, but I didn't linger. I had learned that any delay in the morning threw the rest of the day off. The floor was cold against my bare feet, a small reminder that the heater was set to conserve energy, not comfort. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed and stood, stretching slowly, feeling the tight pull in my lower back loosen with the simple act of standing upright. The first smell that greeted me was coffee, not yet brewed, but the faint residue from the previous night's drip, a bittersweet reminder of the morning ritual to come. In the kitchen, I flicked the switch on the coffee maker, listening to the familiar sputter of water heating and dripping into the carafe. Steam rose in thin, curling wisps, carrying the rich, slightly acidic aroma that always seemed to sharpen my mind. While the coffee brewed, I peeled off yesterday's clothes, stepping into the small bathroom where the warm cascade of the shower waited. The water hit my shoulders first, scalding enough to wake the senses, but not so hot as to feel indulgent. I rotated slowly, letting the spray hit my back, the back of my neck, my arms, mechanical, methodical. My hands worked soap through hair and over skin with the precision of a practiced habit, almost meditative. Even the sound of water pounding against the porcelain tub felt like a grounding drum, marking the start of the day. After the shower, I wrapped a towel around my waist and headed back to the kitchen, where the coffee had just finished brewing. I poured a cup, the liquid steaming into the ceramic mug, and carried it to the small table near the window. The first sip was bitter, but precise. No sugar, no cream, just the raw taste that jolted me into wakefulness. Outside, the street was already alive with motion. The hum of a passing car, the occasional crunch of tires over scattered leaves, the faint whistle of wind through bare branches. I sipped again, eyes scanning the quiet street, noting the rhythm of early commuters, the dog walkers, the occasional jogger. Everything seemed normal, almost banal, and yet a small part of me had begun noticing the oddities, the unusual quiet. The neighborhood left their lights on overnight, the faint yellow tape over a storefront window across the street. By 6:30 a.m., I was dressed, mechanically checking my bag for keys, wallet, and work ID. My shoes hit the floor with a measured thud as I walked toward the door, pausing briefly to glance at the news ticker on the kitchen television. There was a report about a strange illness overseas, brief, almost a footnote, an unusual pneumonia affecting hundreds. I didn't linger on it. I had learned long ago not to let distant stories disrupt my routines. Yet, there was a subtle unease, a faint tension that I tucked away and ignored while locking the apartment door behind me. The commute was predictably rhythmic. I drove along the same roads I had traveled for years, feeling the car respond exactly as it should, noting the same traffic signals, the same slight congestion near the overpass. A few cars bore stickers I hadn't seen before, foreign letters, political slogans, but I focused on the mechanics of driving. Brake, accelerate, check mirrors, adjust temperature. The city seemed normal, the way cities always do before they betray their fractures. Yet I caught snippets of conversation at red lights, hushed remarks about sickness in nearby towns, and the sight of a mass pedestrian ducking quickly into a store. Small anomalies, fleeting, almost dismissible, but lodged in memory like grains of sand. By 7:15 a.m., I arrived at work. The office smelled of coffee and printer toner, the faint metallic tang of machinery in the back where I usually began my technical checks. My coworkers moved with their familiar motions, but some were absent. A quiet unease hovered. Whispers traveled faster than footsteps. A colleague muttered about someone calling out sick again. Another mentioned an unusual strain that had arrived overseas. I nodded politely, but I didn't press for details. I was not yet ready to frame it as a problem that touched me personally. Instead, I moved into the mechanical routines I knew by heart. Inspecting equipment, checking calibration, noting readings. The whir of machinery, the subtle vibrations underfoot, and the repetitive clicking of gauges created a rhythm as predictable as the morning itself. During a break around 9:30 a.m., I glanced at my phone. There were small supply shortages reported at local stores: rice, canned vegetables, bottled water, but nothing alarming. My grocery run last night had been normal, yet the seed of unease had begun. A few co-workers speculated quietly about quarantine zones in distant cities, but the tone was more curious than fearful. I felt the tension rise, a light pressing in my chest, but it was manageable. The world outside was slightly askew, but inside the building, within the walls of routine, there was order. The mechanical tasks offered an anchor, a buffer against uncertainty. By mid-morning, I noticed subtle oddities I couldn't ignore. A delivery truck arrived late, the driver apologizing for delays, the shelves only partially stocked. A colleague sneezed repeatedly, claiming allergies, and another coughed softly at his desk. Conversations in the break room seemed truncated, voices dipping lower when someone mentioned the news. Outside, the wind carried a faint, unpleasant odor, smoky, sour, something unidentifiable. My mind cataloged each anomaly carefully, like a technician recording deviations in a system. Nothing yet warranted alarm, but I recognized the pattern. Small inconsistencies that, if left unexamined, could compound into serious trouble. Lunch was a solitary affair at my desk. I unwrapped a sandwich mechanically, chewing slowly while my eyes flicked between schematics on the monitor and the news ticker. Another report of illness overseas flashed briefly. Hundreds of people quarantined in a city thousands of miles away. I shrugged, taking another bite, yet the subconscious mind logged each detail. Colleagues left early, citing sudden illnesses, and the office grew quieter. It felt unusual, but not yet dangerous. The world had shifted imperceptibly while I followed my routines, unnoticed except for the growing accumulation of oddities. By 2:30 p.m., I was back at my technical station, checking readings, calibrating machinery, and noting minor malfunctions that had begun to creep into our systems. Small errors, intermittent faults, easily corrected. Yet even these minor deviations added to the unease, reinforcing a sense that stability was a fragile construct. Every glance at the news, every whispered comment from a coworker, every half-empty shelf in a store somewhere became another data point in a slowly emerging pattern. It was subtle, imperceptible to anyone not looking closely, yet unmistakable when observed with intent. By the time I drove home that evening, the sky had turned a soft orange, the city's familiar rhythms beginning to settle into evening calm. The smell of exhaust mingled with damp leaves, the crunch of tires over scattered debris in the gutters. Passing grocery stores had lines, short but noticeable, and a few shelves in the windows were conspicuously bare. The world I had left in the morning had shifted almost imperceptibly, and I felt it in the tightness of my chest, the slight pause in my step, the way I scanned streets and alleys as though expecting something out of place. I couldn't name it yet, what exactly was wrong, but the day had accumulated enough evidence to seed a growing, quiet awareness. Normalcy was beginning to fracture, and the fractures, however subtle, were impossible to ignore. The next morning carried the same rhythm, though something had shifted beneath the surface. I arrived at the office and stepped into the mechanical hum of machines, the familiar vibration underfoot grounding me. The scent of oil and warm metal greeted me, mingling with the lingering aroma of coffee from the break room. My work was precise, methodical, inspecting pressure gauges, checking electrical currents, reviewing schematics line by line. Each routine task was a small reassurance that at least this corner of the world remained predictable. Yet subtle anomalies were multiplying. Equipment that had never faltered before now required minor adjustments. A valve that usually responded instantly hesitated, a conveyor belt skipped a beat, and the hum of the generator occasionally wavered. I made careful notes, adjusting tolerances, recalibrating instruments, treating each malfunction as a technical puzzle rather than a symptom of larger trouble. But in the back of my mind, a quiet unease persisted. These were small cracks in a system I had always taken for granted, and while individually minor, collectively they hinted at a fragility I hadn't anticipated. Suppliers' delays began to complicate my work. Replacement parts that normally arrived in 2 days were now showing up late, sometimes in the wrong configuration. I spoke briefly with one of the warehouse staff. Their voice had that same tight, restrained quality I'd started noticing in so many people. They said the trucks got held up somewhere in the south. They explained, shrugging. I accepted the explanation outwardly, but filed the irregularity mentally, like a technician marking deviations in a long-term performance chart. Each delay, each absent shipment, subtly eroded the infrastructure I relied on, even if I couldn't yet see the end game. Co-workers were increasingly absent, their desks empty for hours at a time. Some called in sick, others seemed distracted, moving through tasks with unusual hesitation. One colleague leaned close to whisper, mentioning a weird strain reported in a nearby city. I nodded, aware that panic would do no one any good, but the conversation lodged in my mind. Eyes that had been steady now flickered with an almost imperceptible anxiety. Even the most routine chatter carried undertones of worry, like the vibrations through the machinery I monitored, a subtle resonance signaling instability. Outside, I began noticing oddities in the streets and sidewalks during brief walks for coffee or supplies. A faint, sour smell hung in the air, difficult to place but persistent. Pedestrians moved with unusual slowness or abruptness, sometimes clustering together before dispersing suddenly. On a corner, I observed a man muttering to himself, pacing in tight circles, then stepping quickly into an alley as if he realized someone was watching. It was small, inconclusive, yet enough to trigger the part of the mind trained to notice patterns, to detect anomalies in otherwise predictable systems. By mid-morning, the infrastructure I relied on for work felt increasingly fragile. Equipment malfunctions became more frequent, some minor and easily corrected, others demanding careful attention and temporary workarounds. The supply chain delays compounded this, leaving certain tools unavailable or requiring substitution with less efficient alternatives. It was a calculus of adaptation. Small errors could cascade into major interruptions if unaddressed. I found myself double-checking everything, running calibration tests more frequently than usual, treating every anomaly with scrutiny. My hands moved on autopilot, but my mind was alert, cataloging every irregularity with deliberate care. During a break, I overheard snippets of conversation that carried more weight than their words suggested. Heard the city over by the river is shutting some blocks down. Quarantine zones or something, one voice whispered. Another muttered about hospitals filling up faster than expected. I made no comment, only internalized the information, treating it as a data point in an evolving picture. There was no panic in the office yet, only a quiet acknowledgement that the normal flow of life, supplies, routines, predictability was beginning to strain under invisible pressure. As the afternoon progressed, the tension escalated in imperceptible ways. Machinery required repeated adjustments. Small systems failed temporarily, forcing improvised solutions. A coworker returned from lunch visibly flushed and coughing, though they insisted it was only a cold. Another walked past my desk, avoiding eye contact, carrying a package of hand sanitizer in one hand, glancing nervously at the other employees. Each subtle gesture, each anomaly in behavior, added to a growing mosaic of unease that I cataloged meticulously. It was like tracking fluctuating voltages in a circuit. The variations seemed minor in isolation, but the trend was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. By late afternoon, I stepped outside briefly to collect some tools and inspect equipment in an adjacent building. The wind carried the same faint, sour odor I had noticed before. Empty streets stretched out ahead, unusual for this hour. A delivery van crept down the road cautiously, slowing and stopping to let a small group of pedestrians pass in a way that seemed almost ritualistic. A man standing near a bus stop shifted his weight constantly, eyes darting around, while a child clung tightly to a parent's hand, sensing tension even if they could not articulate it. My eyes absorbed every detail. The way people moved, the brief silences, the slight hesitation in otherwise automatic gestures. My technical mind cataloged them as anomalies in human systems, just as I would note deviations in a machine's operation. Returning inside, I continued to work, calibrating equipment and reviewing logs. The anomalies persisted, some mechanical, some human, some environmental, but I treated each with the same methodical approach. My hands moved through familiar motions, my eyes scanning gauges and diagrams, yet the mind was quietly adjusting to the broader picture. The world was subtly, almost imperceptibly shifting around me. Each small irregularity added weight, a cumulative awareness that the structures I depended on, supplies, human behavior, the machinery itself, were no longer entirely reliable. By the time I left work that evening, the sense of unease had settled into a persistent hum beneath the surface of routine. Streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over empty sidewalks. The hum of the city, usually comforting, now seemed uneven, punctuated by distant sirens and the occasional shout. A few stores had notices taped to the doors. Limited stock, reduced hours. I drove home deliberately, taking note of every deviation from the usual commute. Nothing yet warranted panic, but my mind was cataloging, analyzing, preparing. The realization was dawning. Even the most controlled, methodical systems could fail unexpectedly, and the small failures I observed today were evidence of something broader, something I had yet to fully understand. By nightfall, I sat at my kitchen table, cataloging the day mentally while sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. I listed anomalies quietly in my head. Equipment malfunctions, supplier delays, absentee co-workers, subtle oddities in pedestrian behavior, the faint sour odor in the wind. Each was small, almost trivial alone, but together they formed a coherent pattern that was impossible to ignore. I understood, even then, that my routines and observations were becoming tools of survival in their own right, even if I did not yet know what they might be preparing me for. The world felt slightly off balance, a mechanism with unseen faults, and I was the technician watching, recording, and adapting, aware that the pattern was only beginning to reveal itself. The drive home felt heavier than usual, though the route was familiar, almost comforting. Streetlights flickered sporadically as dusk settled over the city, and the wind carried that same faint sour tang I had noticed the previous day. I parked in my usual spot and paused before stepping out, taking in the near-empty sidewalk and the quiet hum of the neighborhood. A few people moved briskly in the fading light, heads down, shoulders tense. Their movements were efficient but lacked the casual ease I was accustomed to seeing. Even in the small, ordinary details of gait and posture, there was something off. Inside my apartment, the warmth of the heater offered temporary relief, a mechanical buffer against unease. I carried in my work bag, setting it on the counter, and let my hands wander over the familiar surfaces: smooth countertop, cold metal faucet, worn wood of the table. Routine chores grounded me. Washing up, setting the kettle on for tea, checking the mail. Yet each action was underscored by a growing awareness that the world outside was subtly shifting. The news on the television provided fragments of confirmation. Hospitals reporting higher than usual patient volumes, government advisories recommending limited public gatherings, and grocery stores posting warnings about stock shortages. None of it was immediate disaster, but the undercurrent of instability was undeniable. I unpacked a small bag of groceries I had picked up earlier in the day. Canned vegetables, dry rice, bottles of water, mundane, ordinary supplies. Yet when I looked at the shelves, I noticed something strange. The store had been limiting purchases, leaving gaps where products usually stocked abundantly now sat empty. I ran through the mental checklist of what might be necessary over the coming weeks. Items I had once considered luxuries, a spare set of batteries, extra cleaning supplies, suddenly felt prudent. The realization hit me quietly. My usual routines and assumptions about availability were no longer reliable. The evening passed with a careful rhythm. I cooked a simple meal, savoring the familiar smells, the sizzle of oil, the faint caramelization of onions, the earthy aroma of rice simmering. As I stirred and prepared food, I noticed subtle noises from outside. An unfamiliar vehicle idling briefly at the end of the block before driving away, the distant echo of a siren that did not follow the usual emergency pattern, and a low, intermittent murmur that might have been human voices or might not. Each sound drew my attention, registering in the back of my mind without immediately demanding action. Later, as darkness fully enveloped the neighborhood, I made my way to minor household tasks, tightening a loose door hinge, adjusting a wobbly chair, organizing tools on a shelf. These acts of practical attention were soothing, a tactile reassurance that at least within these walls, I could maintain order. Yet outside, anomalies persisted. A neighbor's porch light flickered erratically before going out, and across the street, I noticed the unusual placement of a trash bin. It had been pushed out of alignment with the others, though there was no wind to explain it. Small irregularities like these began to pile together, creating a sense that the environment was no longer entirely predictable. In the quiet of the night, I sat near the window with a cup of tea, surveying the streets. Normally, the sounds of distant traffic, the occasional dog barking, and the murmur of nighttime activity provided a comforting backdrop. Tonight, however, there was a subtle tension in the silence. A car passed slowly, its headlights revealing a brief tableau. A family walking hurriedly, heads bent, movements tight with anxiety. I could see a mother glance over her shoulder, checking for something unseen, while a child clutched her hand, too young to understand but aware of unease. It was a fleeting moment, yet it lingered in my memory, registering as a small, inexplicable signal that the ordinary order of life was fraying. Grocery stores and shops along my route home were showing further signs of strain. Even as I walked past their windows, I noticed that shelves were less stocked than the previous day. One store had a handwritten sign taped to the door, warning customers to limit purchases to 3 items per person for essential goods only. It was not a catastrophic warning, but it was a visible acknowledgement of scarcity, an early hint of systemic stress. I filed it mentally, pairing it with the empty shelves and the quiet streets, creating a mental map of how the small cracks in normalcy were spreading outward from what should have been ordinary, reliable systems. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the building, every distant howl of a dog, every muted hum of a passing vehicle seemed exaggerated, charged with possible meaning. I found myself double-checking locks, scanning the street from the window, listening for anything that deviated from what I expected. Yet, there was no immediate danger, only the sense that the world had shifted in ways I could not fully quantify. My mind cataloged every anomaly, quietly assembling a picture of subtle instability. Unusual vehicle patterns, neighbors' anxious behavior, distant sirens, and faint, unplaceable odors. As the hours passed, I realized that my perception of normalcy had been quietly recalibrated. The apartment, the routines, the small domestic rituals, they became a measured counterweight against the unknown that pressed in from outside. I could maintain control here, in this space, but beyond its walls, the world was changing incrementally, almost imperceptibly, yet undeniably. Each sound, each behavioral irregularity, each sign of supply limitation carried weight. I understood that life, as I knew it, was beginning to feel slightly unsafe, not through any dramatic event, but through the accumulation of minor, persistent deviations. By the next morning, the awareness of subtle disorder had settled into a quiet, constant background hum. The streets below, the neighbors, the grocery shelves, they were all part of a shifting environment that demanded attention, observation, and adaptation. I moved through my routines with the same practical care as always, but the routines themselves had gained new significance. They were not merely habits. They were measures of stability, tools for gauging the changing world. And as I prepared for another day, making breakfast, checking the news, organizing tools, I felt the first real understanding that ordinary life was no longer entirely reliable, that the patterns I had once taken for granted were now fragile, and that careful attention, methodical observation, and cautious preparation were becoming essential. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt normal on the surface, but carried an underlying tension I could no longer ignore. I found myself thinking about the weekend in ways I hadn't before, not as a break from work, but as an opportunity to assess the surrounding landscape. My usual hikes through nearby parks now took on a new significance. I noticed which trails were still maintained, which had overgrown paths, and which could provide a clear vantage over the surrounding terrain. Each step on familiar soil became a small exercise in reconnaissance, an unspoken rehearsal for a time when the ordinary rules of movement might no longer apply. During one late afternoon, I drove along a road that cut through the outskirts of the city, noting the gradual shift from urban density to the beginnings of open land. Fences, often broken or leaning, suggested neglect. Abandoned vehicles sat on side streets, some with doors left ajar as though the occupants had departed in haste. The sun cast long shadows over the landscape, highlighting details I might have overlooked before. A collapsed roof here, a broken fence post there, and the occasional animal foraging near what had once been a well-maintained yard. These observations were cataloged with quiet precision, each one a data point in an assessment of potential isolation. At home, I began mapping potential locations in my mind, sketching rough outlines on scraps of paper. Mountain ridges, steep rock faces, areas less accessible by standard roads. All were considered for their practicality, defensibility, water sources, sunlight exposure, and proximity to resources. It was technical work, a careful assessment of variables rather than an emotional reaction. Still, there was a subtle tension in my chest, a recognition that these were decisions I would one day have to act upon. The ordinary life I had clung to, the apartment, the city, the small domestic routines, was now part of a fragile network that could unravel at any moment. Reports from the news grew increasingly disturbing, though they were still presented in muted tones. A town a few hours away had reported outbreaks of a strange illness. Details were sparse. Unusual symptoms, sudden quarantines, and a brief mention of behavioral abnormalities among affected individuals. At first, I cataloged it like a technical report, data points to be noted, verified, and factored into planning. But the frequency of reports and their proximity to my own environment introduced a subtle unease. What had once been distant and abstract was now creeping closer, suggesting that the hypothetical scenarios I had entertained during hikes and sketches were inching toward reality. During a visit to a local store, I noticed the same undercurrent I had seen before. Shelves partially empty, patrons moving with subtle urgency, and an unspoken tension in the air. People were polite, avoiding direct conversation about what was happening, yet behavior spoke volumes. A neighbor I recognized from the building avoided my gaze, clutching a cart filled with more than seemed reasonable, moving swiftly to complete their purchases. Outside, a few cars idled unnaturally long at intersections, engines running while drivers scanned the area with caution. I cataloged everything, not in panic, but in the quiet calculation of someone evaluating risk and logistics. The evening brought further reflection. I sat at my table, reviewing maps and notes, considering the feasibility of reaching remote ridges without drawing attention. I traced possible paths through forests, measured distances between roads and water sources, and calculated the effort required to transport supplies. Each plan was technical, precise, and detailed. Yet alongside the practicality, a subtle awareness began to emerge. I was considering leaving the city not as a flight from panic, but as a rational measure for maintaining security and self-reliance. The thought was no longer hypothetical. It was a practical option that needed careful evaluation. Neighbors' behavior reinforced my observations. A house a few doors down had increased the frequency of trips to the store, its occupants now moving with visible haste, returning with carts laden with essentials. Another family appeared to avoid common areas, closing windows and keeping lights off in the evening. Even the patterns of ordinary vehicles had shifted. Delivery trucks moved along different routes, and taxis drove slowly, as if avoiding certain areas. Each anomaly reinforced the calculations I was making in private. The city was subtly changing, and its normal rhythms could no longer be taken for granted. I began to prepare in small ways, testing equipment I might need for future isolation. My hiking gear was laid out, inspected, and maintained, boots polished and soles checked, ropes and carabiners examined for wear, backpacks organized for maximum efficiency. Water purification tools were cleaned and tested. Small caches of food and supplies were rotated, ensuring freshness and readiness. Each action was deliberate and measured, a quiet rehearsal that mirrored the precision with which I had handled machines at work. It was methodical, almost ritualistic, and it calmed a part of me that recognized the increasing instability outside. At night, I observed the streets with a new attentiveness. The city that had once felt safe now carried subtle signs of tension. Lights left on at unusual hours, the occasional abandoned car on a side street, and the faint echo of hurried footsteps where there should have been none. I cataloged these details silently, recognizing patterns without letting them dictate panic. Each observation added clarity to the conclusion I had been edging toward for days. Leaving the city, seeking isolation in a remote location, was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a practical measure of personal security. By the end of the week, the assessment was complete. I had considered multiple routes, identified potential locations, and noted the logistical challenges of carrying out a retreat to a ridge or elevated terrain. The decision had shifted from optional to necessary, though it remained practical and deliberate rather than desperate. I felt no need to tell anyone, no impulse to dramatize the choice. This was a personal strategy, a technical solution to an emerging problem. The ordinary life of my apartment, the routines of work, the faint hum of a city moving below, all were now measured against the calculations of security, logistics, and survival. And so, for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the thought in its entirety. I might need to leave the city. Not tomorrow, perhaps not next week, but soon enough that planning, observation, and preparation were essential. The realization carried no panic, only the measured tension of someone who had cataloged the anomalies, noted the subtle fractures in normalcy, and recognized the need for calculated action. Life was beginning to require decisions beyond mere routine. The quiet, methodical preparation of isolation had moved from theory into the realm of practical necessity. Once the decision had settled in my mind, the practical work of preparation began. I approached it with the same methodical, technical mindset I had always applied to tasks. No haste, no panic, only careful calculation. The first step was inventory. I cataloged everything I already had at home: cans of food, bottles of water, medical supplies, tools, and climbing gear stored in a small cabinet. Each item was examined for usability, expiration, and redundancy. If something was lacking or nearing the end of its useful life, I made a note for procurement. I kept meticulous records on paper, cross-referencing quantities against anticipated needs for days, weeks, and eventually months of isolation. My initial excursions to local stores were deliberately understated. I chose hours when traffic was light, avoiding peak times when panic could make people unpredictable. I purchased only small quantities of essential items, spreading out trips over several days. The goal was accumulation without drawing attention, a quiet buildup rather than conspicuous hoarding. Rice, beans, canned vegetables, dried fruits, and powdered milk became the backbone of my food stockpile. Alongside consumables, I acquired basic medical supplies: bandages, antiseptics, painkillers, and cold medications. Everything was logged, rotated, and organized for easy access. The process was meticulous, almost ritualistic, a practical rehearsal for life in isolation. Tools and equipment were another priority. I revisited my climbing gear, checking ropes, harnesses, and carabiners for wear. Small repairs were performed immediately. Frayed threads trimmed, carabiners cleaned and lubricated, knots practiced until my hands could perform them without conscious thought. I acquired additional hand tools, lightweight saws, and multi-purpose knives, storing them carefully so each would be immediately accessible. Even mundane items, duct tape, rope, small tarps, took on renewed significance, their utility amplified by the emerging awareness that ordinary supply chains might fail. Water was treated as the most critical resource. I purchased portable filters, spare cartridges, and collapsible containers, testing each system to ensure functionality. Streams and creeks in nearby hills became points of interest. Their locations noted, accessibility assessed, potential purification methods considered. I ran calculations. Average consumption per day, weight of carried water for transport, and the redundancy required to maintain safe drinking water for extended periods. This attention to detail became comforting, a tangible exercise in preparedness that contrasted with the uncertainty creeping in from the city. Even clothing and protective gear were assessed. I examined layers for durability, breathability, and adaptability to changing weather conditions. Gloves, hats, and waterproof items were checked, repaired, or replaced. I packed duplicates of critical items, ensuring that failure or loss would not immediately compromise my preparedness. Each choice was deliberate. Functionality over aesthetics, durability over comfort, practicality over convenience. The entire effort was a slow, deliberate assembly of resilience, one item at a time. During these quiet supply runs, the world outside was revealing itself in subtle ways. Stores began to display signs restricting quantities, telling patrons that essentials were limited to a handful per person. Lines formed more consistently, often with tense conversations hushed into near whispers. I observed human behavior carefully. People hoarding aggressively, families arguing quietly over what to buy, individuals scanning their surroundings with what appeared to be quiet suspicion. I did not intervene, did not draw attention, but mentally logged patterns of scarcity, behavior, and potential risk. Every observation informed the broader plan for isolation. Law enforcement presence was another variable. Patrols appeared less frequent, responses slower. During one afternoon trip, I noticed a single officer talking with a group of young men who had loitered near a corner store. The officer's posture was casual, but there was a noticeable fatigue in his movements, as if the day-to-day rhythm of enforcement was being tested by unusual circumstances. I recorded these patterns in my mind, understanding that in moments of stress, law enforcement might be stretched thin and their priorities would inevitably shift. Public advisories, though still measured in tone, grew increasingly alarming. Updates urged citizens to avoid gatherings, to report unusual symptoms, and to prepare for potential disruptions in services. Each announcement was cataloged, analyzed, and factored into my planning. They did not provoke panic. They provoked calculation. My mental models of city infrastructure, supply chains, and human behavior were updated daily, the same way I would adjust schematics or troubleshoot machinery at work. The accumulation of supplies became an exercise in logistical strategy. I organized storage to allow easy rotation, older items at the front, newer items at the back, ensuring freshness. I labeled containers clearly, tracking quantities, expiration dates, and usage priority. Food, water, medical supplies, tools, and gear were all separated into categories that allowed immediate retrieval. Redundancy was a guiding principle. Backups for backups, alternative plans for each essential need. The quiet, repetitive nature of this work grounded me, a buffer against the subtle tension rising outside my walls. All the while, the city continued to shift around me. I noticed unusual behaviors on the streets. People moving in clusters rather than individually, sudden bursts of hurried movement, glances over shoulders that suggested unease. Delivery trucks arrived late, sometimes only partially stocked, and one evening I saw a line of residents waiting outside a store long after it had closed, chatting quietly and nervously. Minor incidents, an argument over remaining food, someone attempting to bypass purchase limits, hinted at a fragile social order beginning to show stress. None of this was catastrophic, but each occurrence reinforced the logic of my preparations. By the end of several weeks, my stockpile had grown into a small, organized network of essentials. It was enough for months if carefully rationed, and each item was positioned and cataloged for immediate use. I had water filtration systems, durable tools, non-perishable food, protective clothing, and climbing gear ready. More than mere survival items, they represented control, preparation, and mental readiness. The quiet act of gathering supplies had become a daily ritual, a way to assert agency in a world subtly tipping toward unpredictability. The final stage of this phase was observation. I watched both human and environmental patterns, the spacing of vehicles on the road, the flow of pedestrians, the adjustments in store hours, and the subtleties of public messaging. Every detail was logged mentally, contributing to a larger understanding of the environment I was preparing to leave. Each observation reinforced a single, practical truth. The time to leave the city could come sooner than I anticipated, and preparation would be the difference between controlled retreat and chaos. And so, the quiet, meticulous accumulation of supplies became both action and reassurance. Day by day, I moved through the motions with calm precision, cataloging, rotating, and organizing. The city around me was shifting, human behavior growing subtly more unpredictable, and small cracks in infrastructure becoming increasingly apparent. In this methodical, deliberate work, I found a measure of control, a buffer against uncertainty, and a sense of readiness that would serve as the foundation for the isolation I had decided to seek. The first time I truly saw disorder up close, it came in small, almost imperceptible increments until the accumulation was undeniable. I had decided to make a routine trip into the city, partly to check supplies, partly to maintain some semblance of normal life. The streets felt quieter than usual, the familiar hum of urban activity replaced by irregular pockets of movement. People moved in small clusters or hurried past one another, their eyes darting in ways that suggested suspicion or fear. There was nothing overtly violent, but the rhythm of daily life was fractured, broken into moments of tension punctuating what should have been ordinary flow. At the first intersection, I noticed a man stagger across the street, unsteady on his feet. His clothes were disheveled, and his gaze seemed unfocused, flicking rapidly between passing cars and pedestrians. A pedestrian nearby sidestepped him instinctively, muttering under their breath, and the man disappeared into a narrow alley. There was a faint smell that accompanied him, a sour, acrid tang that seemed to cling to the air, lingering even after he was gone. My instinct was to catalog the anomaly rather than react emotionally, noting posture, gait, and odor, but the encounter left a subtle tension in my chest that refused to dissipate. Further along, I observed a small group of people arguing outside a store. Their voices were low but urgent, gestures sharp and abrupt. The argument centered on access to a limited supply of goods. A line of empty shelves visible through the window emphasized the scarcity. One man shoved another lightly, not violently, but enough to draw attention, and the group dispersed quickly, leaving the store eerily quiet in their wake. The sound of doors closing and the echo of hurried footsteps against the sidewalk resonated oddly in the stillness, emphasizing the irregularity of the day. I made a mental note. Tension over resources was growing, even if it remained under the threshold of chaos. As I continued, I noticed subtle changes in behavior among pedestrians. People walked with a heightened alertness, eyes scanning the surroundings as if expecting something to go wrong. A cyclist braked sharply to avoid a pedestrian who had stepped off the curb unpredictably, their movement jerky and uncoordinated. A street vendor cleaned his stand with unusual diligence, checking each item multiple times, as if anticipating rapid depletion or theft. Even the dogs I passed seemed tense, ears pricked and bodies low, reflecting the unease that had infiltrated the environment. The first unmistakably erratic behavior I encountered occurred near a small park. A man emerged from the trees, moving stiffly, jerking his head to one side repeatedly. He made guttural sounds that were almost words but lacked coherence. People crossing nearby gave him a wide berth, some whispering comments I could not hear. The sounds he produced carried across the emptying street, a low, resonant groan that seemed to vibrate in the chest when one drew near. I stopped briefly, observing from a distance, cataloging the posture, motion, and audible anomaly. My mind recognized that this was no ordinary illness or intoxication. The movement was unnatural, irregular, and alarming. At the same time, the environment reflected small signs of breakdown. A trash bin had been knocked over and left in the street, a loose sheet of metal clanging in the wind against a fence. Nearby, a small vehicle had stalled, doors left open, engine ticking as it cooled. These details were not dramatic individually, but suggested a subtle shift in the ordinary maintenance of the urban environment. Disorder was emerging incrementally, overlapping with human behavior to create an unsettling tableau. By mid-afternoon, I encountered another cluster of unusual activity near a busy intersection. A woman ran, not in the normal briskness of errands or exercise, but in sudden, panicked bursts, weaving between parked cars as though fleeing something unseen. Pedestrians shrank back, crossing the street to avoid her path. Behind her, I caught sight of a man staggering toward the curb, arms flailing awkwardly, tripping and regaining balance repeatedly. The rhythm of life was breaking down into microbursts of chaos, punctuated by otherwise mundane moments. I cataloged each as I would a technical anomaly, variables to track, behavior to understand, patterns to note. The most disturbing moment came when I passed a small plaza. 3 individuals were moving strangely together, not quite walking, not quite running, jerky, uncoordinated motions that seemed inhuman. Their heads tilted at odd angles, and occasional low groans emanated from them, carrying an almost tangible weight across the open space. Bystanders avoided them entirely, stepping around and leaving gaps as if invisible barriers had been erected. The scene was brief but seared into memory, a tableau of human form rendered grotesque and erratic, a clear visual indicator that the world I had known was no longer wholly reliable. Even vehicles reflected the disorder. Delivery vans moved hesitantly, stopping without apparent reason, drivers checking rearview mirrors and side streets with repeated, anxious glances. Traffic lights functioned normally, but few drivers seemed to trust the signals, slowing to almost a crawl, anticipating sudden anomalies. The usual predictability of city infrastructure had begun to fracture, intersecting with human unpredictability to create a tense, uncertain environment. By the time I returned home, the weight of observation pressed heavily. The ordinary commute, the familiar streets, the expected order of human behavior. Each had been disrupted in subtle but unmistakable ways. People moved differently, some erratically, some aggressively, others with exaggerated caution. The environment itself was shifting, small signs of neglect and disorder appearing alongside the behavioral irregularities. For the first time, it was no longer possible to consider the city stable or predictable or safe. That night, I reviewed my mental notes, cataloging everything I had observed. The unsteady man in the alley, the arguing group outside the store, the groaning figure in the park, the jerky cluster in the plaza, the hesitant traffic, and the general shift in pedestrian behavior. Each anomaly reinforced a single truth. Disorder had arrived, first subtly, then unmistakably. This was no longer an abstraction or distant threat. It was here, observable, real, and encroaching. My preparation, quiet accumulation of supplies, and assessment of isolation options suddenly carried immediate, practical significance. The theoretical was now tangible. After witnessing the first tangible signs of disorder in the city, my thoughts increasingly turned to places beyond its bounds. The idea of isolation was no longer hypothetical. It had become an operational priority. I began examining topographical maps with a new intensity, tracing ridges, valleys, and steep inclines, noting access points, potential water sources, and sun exposure. Every detail mattered. How long it would take to reach a location on foot, how visible it might be from distant roads, and whether it could provide natural defensibility. The process was methodical, almost clinical, like plotting coordinates for a system I intended to control completely. Weekend excursions became reconnaissance missions. I drove into the surrounding hills and forests, noting not only the geography, but also human presence, vehicle tracks, and signs of habitation. Abandoned homes appeared more frequently along back roads. Their fences collapsed, lawns overgrown. Occasionally, a distant figure would appear, someone walking briskly, perhaps hiking, perhaps scouting, but they never lingered long enough for me to discern intent. I cataloged each sighting, considering how patterns of human movement could affect both the safety and privacy of a potential cabin site. Water was a critical factor. Streams and small creeks often ran unpredictably along the mountain slopes, but proximity alone was insufficient. I assessed flow rate, clarity, and potential sources of contamination. I noted areas where water pooled naturally and where elevation changes might allow for gravity-fed storage if necessary. Even minor tributaries were recorded, mapped, and cross-referenced with potential cabin sites. The goal was efficiency, a location that could sustain long-term isolation with minimal travel for essential resources. Sunlight and exposure were equally important. I studied ridge orientations, slopes, and the density of surrounding trees. A site on the north side of a ridge might offer concealment, but reduced sunlight could make the interior damp and cold. Conversely, a south-facing ridge offered warmth and solar advantage, but risked visibility from a distance. Each factor was weighed carefully with the recognition that environmental control could be as important as human observation. I sketched diagrams, noting angles of sunlight at different times of the day, and considered natural windbreaks for both comfort and stealth. Defensibility was the final consideration. The ideal site would be naturally difficult to approach, with steep inclines or narrow access paths. I examined rock formations and cliffs that could serve as barriers, and noted areas where undergrowth might provide concealment without impeding movement. Each potential access point was scrutinized. A slope that looked easy could be a risk if it allowed someone or something to climb undetected. The calculations were precise, practical, rooted in anticipation rather than fear. Urban chaos, though distant, informed these choices. On drives into the city outskirts, I observed abandoned vehicles, signs of hasty evacuation, and occasional looting. These patterns reinforced the need for distance. Proximity to roads or towns increased risk of encounters. I noted the locations of major highways and secondary roads, imagining scenarios in which sudden migration or panic could drive people toward the ridges I considered. Safety, I realized, was as much about anticipating human behavior as it was about physical terrain. Wildlife provided further indicators. Tracks, scat, and disturbed underbrush suggested where animals had fled or returned, and subtle changes in behavior were noted. Birds calling at unusual times, deer avoiding certain areas. Though not a primary concern, these details offered indirect evidence of environmental stability and potential threats. Areas with heavy wildlife activity suggested isolation from human intrusion, but also posed considerations for securing food and shelter. I refined my potential locations into a short list. Each site was evaluated on multiple axes: accessibility, water supply, solar exposure, concealment, defensibility, and proximity to potential threats. I ranked them, not emotionally but mathematically, assigning weights to each criterion and comparing trade-offs. Some sites offered excellent concealment but difficult water access. Others provided sunlight and visibility but were more exposed to potential intruders. The process was meticulous, driven by a combination of observation, logic, and practical foresight. Abandoned properties along the outskirts provided additional insight. Their positions revealed natural pathways into the hills, and their conditions suggested how quickly they could be fortified or avoided. I noted the materials used in construction, potential points of entry, and the surrounding vegetation. Each property acted as a case study in both survival and human behavior. What people left behind, what they prioritized in haste, and how the land around them could be leveraged or avoided. By the end of several exploratory trips, a single ridge emerged as the optimal site. It combined elevation, natural barriers, proximity to water, solar advantage, and minimal human interference. From certain vantage points, the city was visible as a distant sprawl, providing orientation without inviting attention. Tracks leading to the ridge were minimal, suggesting infrequent visitation. The slopes were steep but navigable, offering both security and sustainability. It met every criterion I had established through weeks of observation and calculation. As the urban chaos escalated, more reports of abandoned homes, scattered crowds on roads, and faint but disturbing news of disorder. The selection of the ridge solidified in my mind. Planning was no longer optional. The decision to occupy a remote, defensible location had shifted from practical precaution to necessity. I began to imagine logistics, how to transport tools and supplies, where to establish a foundation, and how to ensure minimal visibility during movement. The mental rehearsal of steps, like a technician simulating the sequence of operations, provided a sense of control amid the subtle, growing disorder below. By the time I returned home, the ridge was no longer just a location on a map. It was a potential anchor, a locus of isolation where the unknown chaos of the city could be observed from a distance but avoided. The assessment of terrain, water, sunlight, wildlife, and human behavior had merged into a coherent strategy. I knew the next phase would require careful physical preparation, but for now, the decision was concrete. The cabin would be built, and the ridge would be the site. Planning, calculation, and observation had transformed a theoretical exercise into a practical, necessary step for survival. The first physical reconnaissance of the ridge began at dawn. I packed lightly, bringing only essential tools, climbing ropes, a harness, a small first aid kit, water, and notebooks for observations. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The terrain, when first approached, looked deceptively calm from the distance, but each step closer revealed hidden complexities, jagged rocks, loose soil, and undergrowth that resisted movement. The ridge demanded respect, and I treated the ascent like a precise operation, one misstep potentially catastrophic. I began by examining multiple access points. Some paths appeared passable at first glance, but were obstructed by fallen branches or unstable rocks. Others led to dead ends or cliffs that, while offering defensibility, would make transporting supplies nearly impossible. Each route was documented carefully, noting the slope, potential hazards, and approximate travel time. I experimented with different approaches, timing each ascent, observing sun angles, wind direction, and the way shadows shifted along the rocks. The ridge was not just a location. It was a dynamic environment requiring detailed understanding before committing to permanent occupation. Water access was a priority. A small creek ran partway up the slope, fed by higher springs and seasonal runoff. I traced its path, marking stable points where I could refill containers safely, avoiding steep inclines where a misstep could be fatal. I also considered methods of collection and storage, noting locations suitable for temporary cisterns or gravity-fed systems. The creek itself was modest, but its presence was crucial. Water dictated not just survival, but movement patterns and the potential sustainability of a long-term stay. Vegetation offered both challenges and opportunities. Dense clusters of shrubs provided concealment, but slowed progress and carried the risk of hidden obstacles. Sparse areas allowed rapid movement, but left me exposed. I carefully recorded each type of terrain, mapping a potential approach that balanced cover with efficiency. Deadfalls and broken branches littered the ridge in places, evidence of storms, animal activity, or perhaps earlier human passage. Every detail was cataloged, each potential risk noted for mitigation during future trips with heavier loads. Safety was paramount. Climbing the ridge with only light gear highlighted potential hazards I would not have noticed from a distance. Loose boulders, slippery moss, and sudden drops concealed by undergrowth. I practiced careful foot placement, testing each step and using my hands to steady myself. Where necessary, I employed ropes, simulating the techniques I would later use to haul supplies or construct shelter. Each ascent was deliberate, ensuring that I understood the effort required and could move efficiently without alerting others to my presence. Signs of human activity were subtle but present. A few makeshift footpaths indicated occasional use, though none were recently worn. Pieces of litter, a discarded bottle, and a small scrap of cloth suggested intermittent passage, but nothing threatening. I cataloged these signs, considering both potential dangers and advantages. An unfrequented path could provide discreet access, while repeated tracks might indicate the presence of others who could compromise isolation. Observation was as important as physical ability. The ridge was both a refuge and a zone of calculated risk. Distant sounds carried a strange weight. Occasional sirens from the city, muffled shouts, and faint engine noise were audible even from the ridge, punctuating the otherwise quiet environment. At times, an unsettling, low groan would drift up from the valley below, untraceable, but enough to make the hair on my arms rise. I cataloged each sound carefully, noting time, direction, and potential source. Awareness of these cues became as critical as mastering the physical terrain. The ridge demanded vigilance, and every anomaly required attention without reaction. I began envisioning the cabin's placement. Flat ledges suitable for foundation work were scarce. The ridge was mostly jagged rock interspersed with smaller plateaus. I measured angles, estimated leveling requirements, and identified natural barriers that could act as defensive features. Sunlight angles and prevailing wind directions were considered to optimize warmth, dryness, and concealment. Each potential site was assessed in detail, weighing practicality against exposure, and I mentally prioritized locations that balanced all factors with minimal need for alteration. The first attempts at moving small loads of materials highlighted the difficulty of the terrain. Even carrying a lightweight pack, I had to plan each step using ropes and handholds for support. I tested different paths for efficiency, noting which angles allowed safe ascent and descent. Loose stones occasionally slid beneath my feet, forcing recalibration of balance. I considered future trips with heavier loads and the additional precautions they would require, anchoring ropes, distributing weight strategically, and identifying temporary resting points to reduce fatigue and risk. Observation of wildlife was equally important. Tracks in the soil revealed the presence of deer, small mammals, and occasionally larger predators. Birds circled above, their calls punctuating the quiet, alerting me to movement that could signal potential threats or opportunities. I began noting patterns, where animals gathered, paths they traveled, and areas they avoided. Such knowledge would inform not just survival strategies, but also the cabin's final placement and approach routes, ensuring that both natural and human hazards could be monitored and mitigated. By late afternoon, I had completed multiple reconnaissance trips, each adding to a detailed mental map of the ridge. I had determined optimal access points, identified hazards, recorded water sources, noted wind and sunlight patterns, and cataloged potential cabin sites. The ridge, once an abstract location on a map, had become tangible, a layered system of terrain, resources, and risk. I now understood the effort required to secure and maintain it, and the calculations provided both confidence and caution. Returning home, exhaustion was tempered by clarity. The ridge was viable, but only with meticulous preparation, careful navigation, and strict adherence to observed patterns. The physical effort of exploration had highlighted both possibilities and vulnerabilities. Success would require planning, precision, and patience. In the quiet of the evening, I reviewed notes, sketches, and mental observations, consolidating them into a cohesive plan. The next step, transporting materials and beginning construction, would demand the same methodical approach as every stage before. Securing the ridge had transformed it from a potential location into a calculated objective. The combination of topography, water, vegetation, wildlife, and human observation provided both opportunity and challenge. With careful planning, it could become a refuge, Without preparation, it could be treacherous. The work had been physical, exhausting, and exacting, but it also solidified a sense of control in an increasingly unpredictable world. I now had a foundation for action, terrain I understood, and a strategy for transforming the ridge from a theoretical refuge into a practical, sustainable shelter. Construction began the following morning, just as the sun's first rays illuminated the ridge. I approached the task like any technical project: methodical planning, step-by-step execution, and attention to every detail. The ridge, once a distant concept, now required transformation into a practical, livable space. I had selected a relatively flat ledge, sheltered from prevailing winds, partially concealed by natural outcroppings of rock and clusters of pine. Its surface was uneven, but workable. My first step was clearing debris, fallen branches, loose stones, and scrub that would interfere with a stable foundation. Each piece was examined before removal to ensure I wasn't disturbing natural supports or creating hazards that might compromise stability. Transporting materials posed the first significant challenge. My backpack could carry only a limited load, so I had to make multiple trips. Rocks were carefully selected for size and stability, forming the base of the foundation. Logs were trimmed and lashed together with rope, the friction points reinforced with smaller branches and natural wedges to stabilize the frame. Each movement was deliberate, calculated to prevent slips and to minimize noise. I needed to ensure that the ridge remained unnoticed while simultaneously allowing for efficient construction. Once the foundation was established, I began framing the cabin. The walls were constructed with a combination of logs and reinforced branches, lashed together at stress points. I used natural inclines to support weight where possible, reducing the need for complex joinery. Each wall was carefully aligned, leveled, and checked against sun angles, wind direction, and access points. Small adjustments were made continuously. Even minor deviations could compromise stability or make the structure more visible. I relied on techniques I had used in mechanical work: precision, measurement, and repeated verification to guide each stage. Flooring presented another challenge. The ledge was uneven and partially rocky, so I laid a subfloor of smaller logs, packing gaps with stones and debris to create a stable surface. Above this, I layered planks scavenged from abandoned sites and reinforced them with rope bindings. The floor was not perfect, but it was secure and functional. Every footfall would be predictable, minimizing risk of injury. I tested the structure continuously, applying weight to each section and adjusting support points as needed. Repetition and reinforcement were key. The structure had to be reliable under every condition I anticipated. The roof required particular attention. I wanted to balance protection from the elements with minimal visibility. Logs formed the primary framework, angled to allow rain runoff and snow accumulation to slide naturally. Pine branches and smaller limbs were interwoven to create a thick, insulating layer, supplemented with moss and soil for further coverage. The goal was a roof that blended into the ridge, using natural textures and colors to reduce the chances of detection. Each section was tested for stability, ensuring it would not collapse under weight or high winds. As I worked, the ridge itself demanded constant attention. Loose rocks, shifting soil, and sudden gusts reminded me that construction on a natural formation required vigilance. I scanned constantly for potential hazards: overhanging branches, unstable outcrops, and signs of animals or intruders. Any misstep could be dangerous, not only for myself, but for the integrity of the cabin. Each stage of construction was performed with an awareness of my own limitations, combining skill, caution, and adaptability. Water and sanitation were incorporated into the build from the start. I established a small, reinforced area to collect rainwater, directing it toward a storage container at the cabin's rear. Nearby, a shallow pit was designated for waste, reinforced with stones and covered discreetly. These measures were practical, sustainable, and designed to minimize environmental disruption while maintaining cleanliness. I treated water purification devices as essential, testing each system during the construction process to ensure readiness once the cabin became operational. Isolation brought a new set of psychological challenges. The ridge was quiet, almost oppressively so. Each sound, branches snapping, wind rustling through pine needles, distant groans from below, was amplified in my perception. I developed routines to monitor surroundings without interrupting work, pausing to listen, scanning the ridge line, noting anomalies. Tracks in soil or broken branches near the approach were recorded mentally, ensuring that nothing escaped attention. Construction provided both purpose and structure, yet the environment reminded me that isolation was not just physical but also perceptual. The occasional presence of wandering individuals added tension. From a distance, I saw figures moving along lower slopes, often too far to identify clearly. Some were hikers, others possibly scavengers, and a few moved in ways that triggered an instinctive sense of unease. I adjusted construction routines accordingly, transporting materials during times of minimal visibility, using natural cover for short ascents and descents, and planning breaks during periods when a ridge was most concealed. Each step was calculated to minimize risk while maintaining progress. Night brought new challenges. The absence of city light revealed the ridge in stark contrast to the valley below. Shadows shifted unpredictably, making familiar features appear different and potentially threatening. I completed essential tasks before darkness, using minimal artificial light. Fires were avoided entirely, both for smoke visibility and heat signature. Instead, I relied on reflection and moonlight to guide minor adjustments, preserving stealth while continuing construction. As the cabin began to take shape, small details required continuous attention. Doors and windows were framed with reinforced logs, gaps filled with moss or bark to insulate and conceal. Interior spaces were partitioned for storage, sleeping, and work areas. Shelves were built along walls for tools and supplies, optimizing vertical space. Every modification was tested for practicality, durability, and discretion. I imagined scenarios: heavy rain, strong wind, potential intrusion, and planned reinforcements accordingly. Each adjustment increased both comfort and resilience. External observation points were integrated into the design. From small openings, I could scan the surrounding slopes and distant ridges without exposing myself. These points were angled to provide maximum coverage while remaining subtle. I cataloged lines of sight, potential approach paths, and natural obstructions, creating a mental map of both defensive and observational priorities. Every day, I walked these routes, reinforcing knowledge and updating strategies as needed. By the time the cabin was mostly complete, I had spent weeks on the ridge, physically exhausted but mentally fortified. The structure was modest but functional. A secure foundation, reinforced walls, insulating roof, water collection, storage, and observation points. The cabin was not just shelter. It was a physical manifestation of preparation, calculation, and adaptation. It provided both security and psychological relief, a tangible anchor amid the uncertainty below. Even as the last planks were secured, the ridge reminded me that isolation carried vigilance. Broken branches, faint tracks, and distant groans hinted at ongoing movement, human, animal, or otherwise. Yet within the cabin, each element had been considered: stability, concealment, and readiness for unpredictable circumstances. Completion was both practical and symbolic, representing a transition from observation and preparation to sustained survival. The final act of the initial build was consolidation, organizing tools, storing supplies, checking rope systems, and testing water collection. Each routine reinforced readiness, establishing patterns that would carry forward into daily life on the ridge. As I stepped back to observe the cabin from a distance, it blended into the ridge almost seamlessly, a quiet testament to methodical work and attention to detail. The structure was small, isolated, and defensible, precisely what I had planned from the earliest reconnaissance trips. The first days in the completed cabin were a mixture of relief and adjustment. The structure itself provided a tangible sense of security, yet isolation carried a weight I hadn't fully anticipated. I spent hours moving supplies into organized zones. Food in one corner, tools along a wall, water and filtration systems near the small storage area, and emergency equipment in accessible spots. Every item had a designated place, rotated and cataloged to ensure usability over weeks or months. Establishing order within the cabin was as important as physical safety. It provided a sense of control in an environment where uncertainty now defined the world outside. Daily routines became essential. I rose with the sun, maintaining a schedule reminiscent of life before isolation, though now dictated by natural markers rather than clocks or external obligations. Mornings were spent inspecting the ridge, checking the integrity of supports, verifying that pathways remained secure, and scanning for tracks or anomalies. Each observation was logged mentally and occasionally sketched in a small notebook. Patterns emerged, where animals moved, how the wind shifted, how shadows changed on the ridge. This constant vigilance was both practical and psychological, anchoring my mind in tangible tasks while monitoring potential risks. Meal preparation became a ritual. Cooking was deliberate, using ration portions and rotating stored food for freshness. Simple routines, boiling water, sterilizing utensils, layering meals for efficiency, provided structure and reassurance. I noted the weight and caloric value of each meal, ensuring that resources would sustain energy needs over time. Meals were taken slowly, often while observing the slopes below, allowing me to monitor wildlife, potential human movement, and distant environmental changes without compromising safety. Tools and equipment required daily maintenance. Ropes, carabiners, and climbing gear were inspected for wear, knots tested for reliability, and minor repairs performed immediately. Wooden supports were checked for cracks or instability. Flooring, roof, and walls were reinforced as needed. Even minor oversight could become catastrophic in isolation, so diligence was constant. Each task was repetitive yet grounding, a rhythm that provided both productivity and mental focus. Observation became a central aspect of daily life. From small openings in the cabin, I scanned the slopes, distant ridges, and any visible settlements below. Patterns in human absence were noted. Roads that had become empty, occasional smoke from distant fires, or glimmers of movement suggesting temporary habitation. Wildlife provided indirect intelligence. Tracks in soil, shifts in bird flight patterns, and the occasional glimpse of larger animals reminded me that I shared the environment with other predators. Every observation informed strategies for both movement and resource management. Isolation also demanded careful attention to noise and light. Any activity outside the cabin required mindfulness. Footsteps on loose rocks could carry further than expected, and fires or reflective surfaces could attract attention from distant observers. I adapted by conducting heavy labor during daylight when shadows and terrain offered natural concealment, limiting movement near edges, and using covered pathways for transporting materials. Minimal artificial light was employed inside, primarily for critical tasks at dusk, with careful measures to ensure it could not be seen from below. Psychologically, solitude introduced new challenges. Initially, the mind sought the rhythm of social interaction, conversations, background noise, even the subtle presence of neighbors. The absence of these markers created periods of heightened awareness and introspection. I established internal routines to mitigate this. Exercises to maintain physical fitness, repeated equipment checks, and consistent environmental monitoring. By filling the day with purposeful, practical activity, I prevented the mind from drifting toward panic or despair. The tasks themselves became both mental and physical anchors. Weather imposed its own adjustments. Storms brought high winds and sudden rainfall, testing both cabin integrity and preparedness. During heavy precipitation, I reinforced walls, cleared drainage paths, and checked for leaks. Snow accumulation required careful monitoring, ensuring that roof load remained manageable and paths did not become obstructed. These natural cycles reinforced the importance of vigilance and adaptation, emphasizing that survival depended not only on preparation, but on ongoing interaction with the environment. Supply management was another crucial aspect. I rotated food stocks to prevent spoilage, tracked water usage, and ensured filtration systems remained functional. Minor failures, filters clogged, containers cracked, or stored materials shifted, required immediate attention. These tasks demanded both foresight and flexibility, reinforcing the connection between preparedness and survival. Even small lapses could have outsized consequences, highlighting the importance of routine and diligence. Sound became a subtle source of information. The wind, distant wildlife, and occasional human noises below were cataloged continuously. Unfamiliar sounds, snap of a branch, a distant groan, or movement on slopes I had considered secure, triggered careful observation. I refrained from immediate reaction, instead cross-referencing with prior patterns to determine the significance. Each anomaly was analyzed, logged, and integrated into a broader understanding of the ridge's security. Awareness was constant, yet not paralyzing. The goal was preparedness, not fear. Evening routines mirror mornings. I performed final inspections, reinforced structures if needed, and organized tools for the next day. Meals were consumed, water supplies checked, and notes updated. Before resting, I conducted a thorough observation of surrounding slopes, noting any movement, shadows, or environmental changes. This final check provided both reassurance and continuity, establishing a predictable pattern that structured time within the isolation of the cabin. Over weeks, the ridge and cabin became an extension of routine and self-reliance. Each day was a blend of observation, maintenance, and small adaptations. My mental framework shifted. The external world was distant and unpredictable, yet the ridge was stable, controllable, and predictable within the limits of preparation. Isolation was no longer an emergency measure, but a managed environment, with routines providing security, purpose, and resilience. Social absence remained challenging, but observation, planning, and activity filled the void. Each task, from organizing supplies to maintaining equipment, reinforced the connection between effort and survival. Nature, both friend and adversary, dictated attention to detail, yet also provided continuity and context. Solitude was not emptiness, but structured engagement with the immediate environment, a constant balance of awareness, labor, and adaptation. By the end of the first month, I had established a daily rhythm. Morning inspections, midday maintenance and observation, evening reinforcement and preparation. Each routine anchored both survival and mental stability, ensuring that the cabin was functional, secure, and adaptable. Solitude, once intimidating, had become a framework for disciplined engagement with the world, a controlled environment within an otherwise unpredictable reality. From the ridge, the world below began to reveal itself in stark relief. Settlements that once pulsed with ordinary life now appeared abandoned or sporadically occupied. Roads were mostly empty, punctuated occasionally by the slow movement of vehicles or the hurried passage of figures moving with intent. Fires burned intermittently, their smoke curling into the sky, a signal of temporary occupation or mismanaged chaos. I observed quietly, cataloging each detail, aware that visibility offered information but also required caution. The ridge provided a safe vantage point, a controlled observation post for which the patterns of collapse could be studied without exposure. Daily observation became a structure practice. I divided the horizon into sectors, scanning each with consistent focus, noting changes in terrain, movement, and environmental indicators. Tracks in mud, scattered debris, and signs of temporary encampments were logged mentally and occasionally sketched in notebooks. Each detail contributed to a broader understanding of the world below, allowing me to anticipate risks and adapt routines without direct engagement. Patterns emerged, areas of repeated activity, zones entirely abandoned, and locations where movement was erratic or suspicious. Wildlife was a critical point of study. Deer, foxes, and occasional larger predators moved with predictable patterns, often filling voids left by human absence. Birds congregated in areas where structures have been abandoned, their calls carrying across otherwise silent streets and hills. Observing these shifts offered both practical and psychological insight. The environment was reclaiming itself in unpredictable ways, and survival required attunement to its rhythms. Movement of animals also acted as an early warning system, highlighting potential hazards or human activity below. Signs of permanent collapse were increasingly visible. Homes were left open, doors ajar, belongings scattered as if inhabitants had fled suddenly. Vehicles were abandoned along roadsides, some partially dismantled or burnt. Occasional smoke suggested temporary habitation, but the lack of consistent patterns indicated instability. Fires appeared uncontained at times, hinting at neglect or panic-driven activity. These observations were cataloged meticulously, providing both situational awareness and confirmation of the severity of the collapse. I began to notice subtle anomalies in human behavior that suggested transformation or altered cognition. Figures moved with jerky, unnatural motion in the distance, sometimes pausing mid-step, heads tilting at unusual angles. Groups formed and dissolved unpredictably, often avoiding or disregarding others entirely. Even when visibility was limited, the posture and coordination of certain individuals was irregular, suggesting physiological or psychological changes beyond normal stress or panic. These anomalies became increasingly difficult to interpret, but were consistently recorded for analysis. The landscape itself reflected the collapse. Streets that once carried steady traffic were silent, cracked, or littered with debris. Parks and recreational areas were overgrown. Water sources were partially obstructed by fallen trees or sediment. And infrastructure, such as power lines and bridges, appear neglected. Even urban lighting failed at night, leaving shadows and darkness to dominate the horizon. The lack of maintenance reinforced a sense of permanence in the abandonment, a realization that recovery, if possible, would be slow and arduous. Observation was supplemented by methodical note-taking. I sketched key areas, recorded timings of movement, and created mental and physical maps of the surroundings. These records allowed cross-referencing. If tracks appeared in one location on multiple days, their origin and destination could be inferred. Unexplained anomalies, sudden disappearances of vehicles, odd movements in distant hills were noted with special attention. Each piece of information contributed to a growing understanding of both human behavior and environmental change, forming the basis for strategic decisions regarding supply routes, movement, and risk assessment. Reflections became a daily practice alongside observation. I considered not only the physical changes, but the psychological and societal implications. The scale of abandonment suggested that the collapse was comprehensive, affecting both the infrastructure and the social order. Individuals observed below were either temporary occupants, fleeing humans, or altered in ways that defied expectation. These reflections guided both practical decision-making, how to approach food sources, avoid human contact, maintain safety, and mental adaptation, reinforcing the need for patience, vigilance, and resilience. Occasionally, distant activity provided insight into patterns of human movement. Convoys of vehicles appeared along secondary roads, sometimes carrying goods or groups of people, other times abandoned mid-journey. Temporary shelters formed near water sources or abandoned structures, often leaving signs of occupation visible for days. I cataloged these trends, calculating intervals of activity, probable motivations, and potential consequences for ridge security. Anticipation of human behavior became as important as observation of terrain or wildlife. Weather and environmental shifts were integrated into the reflective process. Storms altered visibility, washed out tracks, and sometimes revealed hidden paths or vulnerabilities. Snowfall provided fresh indicators of movement, while wind patterns carried scents and sound from below. I developed mental models connecting environmental factors with human and wildlife behavior, refining routines and movement strategies accordingly. Observation, reflection, and adaptation formed a feedback loop, creating both a defensive posture and a framework for understanding the New World Order. Psychological endurance became increasingly central. The act of watching and reflecting reinforced a sense of agency despite isolation. I recognized the importance of structured activity, preventing the mind from succumbing to fear, boredom, or despair. Observation was not passive. It required active categorization, analysis, and anticipation. Each day reinforced that preparedness and understanding were inseparable. The more I observed, the more effectively I could act if necessary. By the end of several weeks on the ridge, patterns of collapse became undeniable. Entire districts were abandoned, fires burned intermittently without intervention, and human activity was limited and erratic. Wildlife had begun to repopulate spaces once dominated by humans. The anomalies in posture, movement, and coordination among distant figures suggested that the transformation was ongoing, pervasive, and unpredictable. The world below had fundamentally changed, and the ridge provided a secure vantage point from which to navigate this new reality. Reflection also reinforced the importance of routine. Daily observation, maintenance, and cataloging created structure in isolation, mitigating the psychological challenges of solitude. Each detail, from environmental cues to human behavior, was integrated into a growing understanding of survival strategies. Knowledge became both shield and guide. The more I knew, the more capable I became of anticipating change, minimizing risk, and sustaining life on the ridge. The ridge was no longer simply a refuge. It had become a lens through which the collapse could be studied, understood, and anticipated. Observation and reflection provided clarity, reinforcing both practical survival skills and mental resilience. Isolation was not empty. It was structured engagement with a world that had fundamentally altered. Every anomaly, every subtle change, was integrated into a growing map of knowledge, supporting both immediate safety and long-term endurance. By the time I'd settled fully into the cabin, life on the ridge had shifted from preparation to endurance. The routines I had established, observation, maintenance, supply management, and environmental monitoring, had become second nature. The cabin itself was secure and functional, a tangible reflection of my labor and foresight. Beyond it, the ridge stretched like a silent sentinel, offering both protection and perspective. Time was no longer measured in days of work or social engagement, but in sunlight, seasonal changes, and the completion of essential tasks. The structure of my life had adapted to the isolation, and I had adapted to it in turn. Daily life followed a consistent pattern, dictated by necessity and observation. Mornings began with inspection of the ridge and surrounding slopes, checking pathways for signs of intrusion, observing wildlife, noting any changes in distant human activity. These observations were recorded mentally, occasionally in sketches or notes, forming an evolving understanding of the environment. Midday was devoted to maintenance, reinforcing structures, organizing supplies, and addressing minor repairs. Even small deviations, loose boards, sagging rope, clogged filters, were addressed immediately. Vigilance was continuous, but repetitive labor provided a sense of stability and purpose. Food and water management remained critical. Rations were carefully measured, rotated, and stored to prevent spoilage. Water collection systems were checked daily. Filters were cleaned or replaced as needed. Foraging was limited to nearby vegetation or occasional trips along secure routes, always planned to minimize risk and maintain discretion. The predictability of these routines contrasted sharply with the unpredictable world below. By anchoring life to structured tasks, I preserved both physical safety and mental equilibrium. Observation continued to dominate my daily existence. From the cabin's openings, I scanned the horizon, noting patterns and changes in the abandoned settlements, wildlife movements, and environmental conditions. Fires in distant towns, erratic human movement, or altered animal behavior were integrated into my understanding of risk. The more I watched, the the more the world below became a system of variables, each change requiring adaptation. The act of observing became both a survival tool and a means of engaging the mind, providing focus and discipline in the isolation of the ridge. The psychological adaptation was gradual but thorough. Initially, the absence of human contact brought unease, sometimes manifesting as fleeting anxiety or heightened sensitivity to sound. Over time, structured routines and focused observation replaced fear with methodical calm. Each task, repairing a wall, cleaning a filter, organizing supplies, became both practical and symbolic, a demonstration of control in a world increasingly unpredictable. Isolation was no longer a trial, but a managed environment in which survival could be reliably maintained. Environmental awareness grew into a form of continuous mindfulness. Storms, snowfall, and wind patterns were anticipated and planned for. Even minor changes in shadows or scent were noted for potential significance. The ridge itself became familiar in a way that extended beyond physical geography. The subtle shifts in soil moisture, the sounds of distant wildlife, the patterns of light through the trees. Each observation contributed to a growing sense of security and competence, reinforcing both practical preparedness and psychological stability. Time became defined by natural markers and task completion. Seasons dictated clothing, heating, and food storage. Daily light cycles guided activity, and the completion of maintenance, observation, and resource management dictated progress. The absence of social structures or urban schedules created both freedom and responsibility. Life was measured in tasks executed and patterns understood, and each day of survival reinforced the effectiveness of routine, attention, and preparation. Occasional signs of distant activity continued to punctuate life. Flickers of movement, smoke from abandoned settlements, or altered patterns of animal behavior reminded me that the world below remained unpredictable. These instances were neither immediately threatening nor fully comprehensible. Instead, they were integrated into mental maps of risk, informing decisions without dictating panic. Preparedness and observation were sufficient to mitigate exposure, and the cabin on the ridge remained a secure vantage point for which the changing world could be monitored safely. The physical demands of the ridge persisted. Paths remained challenging, weather-imposed limits, and the cabin required continuous care. Yet each task, repeated daily, became part of a rhythm that defined life. Exercise, labor, and maintenance were integrated seamlessly into routines, providing both practical benefit and psychological grounding. The ridge, once a site of reconnaissance, had become an environment of consistent engagement, a space where every action had purpose and consequence. Reflection became increasingly prominent. I considered the permanence of isolation, the transformation of the world below, and the fragility of human order. Entire settlements had collapsed, infrastructure decayed, and remaining humans behaved unpredictably, often in ways that suggested physiological or psychological changes. These reflections reinforced the necessity of vigilance, but also the adequacy of preparation. My position on the ridge provided both safety and clarity. The collapse could be studied, understood, and navigated from a secure vantage point. Mental endurance was reinforced through careful engagement with routine and observation. Each task, no matter how mundane, was an opportunity to maintain control, focus, and adaptability. This structured engagement prevented drift into despair or panic, transforming isolation from a psychological hazard into a managed condition. The act of observing, maintaining, and adjusting became a continuous feedback loop, linking physical survival with mental resilience. Seasons passed, each reinforcing the stability and adaptability of life on the ridge. Snow, rain, and heat were anticipated and mitigated through established routines. Supplies were carefully monitored, food rotated, and water managed with precision. Wildlife continued to adjust to human absence, providing both challenges and indicators for decision-making. The ridge, cabin, and surrounding environment formed an integrated system. Survival depended on observation, labor, and strategic adaptation. Acceptance emerged naturally. The ridge was safe, the cabin was secure, routines were effective. Beyond this, the world below was unpredictable, but unnecessary exposure had been minimized. Life was neither carefree nor comfortable, but it was sustainable. Each task completed, each observation recorded, and each risk mitigated contributed to a persistent sense of competence. Isolation had become a managed condition, and endurance was both practical and psychological, a measured, deliberate engagement with the realities of the new world. The final stage of adaptation was reflection on permanence. The cabin and ridge were no longer temporary measures. They were home, laboratory, and observation post. Time, measured by tasks, environmental cues, and seasonal changes, provided structure. External events, distant movements, fires, or groans, were noted, considered, and integrated into ongoing strategies. The world had changed irreversibly, and the ridge provided the means to continue life carefully, quietly, and deliberately. In the quiet moments, I understood that survival was not merely physical endurance, but the integration of knowledge, observation, and routine into a sustainable way of life. The ridge, the cabin, and my practices had transformed into a cohesive system, one where awareness, preparation, and mental discipline maintained both safety and continuity. Sporadic activity below remained unpredictable, but it no longer dictated my existence. I had established a rhythm, a framework of endurance, and a secure vantage from which life could continue. At the edge of the ridge, looking out over the distant, altered world, there was a profound stillness. The city below was a distant memory. The valley, the hills, and the occasional flicker of movement were all that remained tangible. Yet within this isolation, life persisted. The cabin was functional, the ridge was secure, and routines provided both structure and reassurance. Survival had become normalized, vigilance habitual, and endurance a quiet, deliberate practice. The world could shift unpredictably below, but the ridge remained constant, a measured domain of security, observation, and controlled engagement. Life continued, careful, quiet, deliberate, and sustained. Each day was a repetition of observation, labor, reflection, and adaptation, forming a rhythm that balanced safety, mental clarity, and the realities of isolation. The collapse below was ongoing, unpredictable, and distant, but within the ridge and cabin, existence was fully manageable. Here, survival was complete, not by accident, but by preparation, attention, and acceptance. The world had changed irreversibly. I had adapted.